Family went missing. During mountain trip 3 weeks later, a wildlife camera captures this. It was the morning of January 15th, 2023, when the storm hit the mountain like a hammer on an anvil. The local news had warned of heavy snowfalls, but nothing quite prepared the small town of Raven Ridge, nestled at the foot of the towering Blackpine Mountain, for the kind of blizzard that would come to define this story. The wind howled, and the temperatures plummeted so fast that it felt like the world had frozen in an instant. Ellie Whitaker had been a regular at the lodge for years. A woman of indomitable will and stubborn resilience, Ellie was well known by the staff and visitors alike. At 67, she didn't mind the hard work required to run the family-owned lodge. Her son Daniel and his wife Rachel had come along for the winter vacation, bringing their 2 daughters, Wren and Ivy. The family had been struggling in recent months. Daniel, a successful lawyer, had been under immense stress, his marriage to Rachel unraveling faster than he could hold it together. But on that fateful morning, all Ellie knew was that her family, her son, his wife, and her 2 young granddaughters had vanished into the unforgiving wilderness of Blackpine Mountain. Ellie had gone to bed the night before feeling uneasy. The tension between Daniel and Rachel was palpable, and it wasn't lost on Ellie. She'd noticed the way Rachel would snap at Daniel, how his once bright demeanor had become a shadow of himself. But she never imagined it would come to this. When Ellie woke up, the mountain was hidden beneath a blanket of white, and something felt wrong. It was the last time anyone would see Daniel alive. By late morning, Ellie began calling around the lodge and local area, trying to piece together what had happened. The police had been informed, and a search party was already out, combing the area. Ellie felt her pulse quicken as the reality began to sink in. This wasn't an ordinary storm. This was something different. Daniel, Rachel, and the girls were out there lost in the snow somewhere on Blackpine Mountain. By noon, the news was already circulating in town. A family was missing. People murmured about how the storm had struck, suddenly leaving little time for anyone to prepare. Some locals spoke of hearing screams in the early hours of the morning, though no one could say where they had come from. Ellie didn't buy into the rumors. She knew her son. He wasn't the kind of man to just disappear. Something had happened. Something wrong. The authorities quickly mobilized a search team. The first few hours they focused on the immediate vicinity around the lodge, then began working their way up toward the mountain trails. They found signs of movement in the snow, but no one, not even the most seasoned hikers and trackers, could find a trace of Daniel or the others. The deeper they went into the forest, the more the trail seemed to vanish, swallowed by the snow. Ellie's mind raced. Could they have gone off the trail? Maybe Daniel had tried to protect Rachel and the girls from the storm, or was it something else? Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. She'd seen the way Rachel had been acting lately, how quick she was to blame Daniel for everything that went wrong in their lives. Maybe she'd finally snapped. But then again, Ellie didn't want to believe it. Could a mother really abandon her children like that? As the hours wore on, Ellie's frustration grew. She had seen Daniel struggle, but he wasn't someone to just give up. His determination to keep his family together was a part of who he was. Yet now no one could find him. No one could explain what had happened. The next morning the unimaginable happened. At dawn, a lone figure emerged from the tree line, a young girl, pale and trembling, dragging herself through the snow. It was Wren. Ellie had been among the first to spot the girl. She didn't recognize her at first. Wren's face was covered in frost, her clothes torn and dirty. But there was no mistaking those wide, frightened eyes. Ellie rushed to her side, her heart pounding in her chest. "Wren," Ellie shouted. The girl's eyes locked on her, and for a moment Ellie thought she saw a flicker of recognition before the girl collapsed into her arms. Wren was barely conscious. Her left leg was clearly injured, and Ellie could feel the child's body trembling from the cold. As Ellie knelt in the snow, cradling her granddaughter, she felt a chill run through her, a chill that wasn't just from the winter air. "Where's your mom, your dad?" Ellie asked, her voice hoarse with panic. Wren's small, trembling voice barely reached Ellie's ears. Mom's not with me." I don't know. Ellie's stomach dropped. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The search party was nearby, and Ellie called out for help. Medical assistance arrived quickly, and Wren was taken into care, but Ellie's mind was spinning. Where was Rachel? What had happened to Daniel? As Ellie held her granddaughter in her arms, Wren's voice was faint, as though the child was about to pass out. "Mom left me. I tried to keep up, but her voice trailed off into unconsciousness." By late afternoon, Ellie's phone rang. It was the police. Ms. Whitaker, the officer on the other end, said, "We've found something." "It's not good." Ellie could barely breathe. They had found Daniel, or what was left of him. His body had been discovered at the base of a steep cliff. It wasn't an accident. He had been pushed. The police were sure of it. But who did it? The investigation began, and Ellie couldn't stop herself from thinking about Rachel. The woman had always been distant cold, even to her own children. But murder. Could she really be capable of something so vile? The more Ellie thought about it, the more she became certain. Rachel had killed Daniel, and she had left Wren and Ivy to die in the snow. But where was Ivy? Ellie didn't have much time to process the overwhelming grief that threatened to consume her. There were questions that needed to be answered. The search for Ivy was on, and the chilling reality of this mountain mystery was just beginning to unfold. With each passing hour, the story of the Whitaker family's disappearance grew darker. And in the pit of Ellie's heart, she knew this wasn't just a missing persons case. This was something far more sinister. But why had Rachel abandoned her children? What had driven her to push her husband off that cliff, and what happened to Ivy? The questions piled up one after another, each more pressing than the last. The story of the Whitaker family wasn't just a disappearance. It was a twisted tale of betrayal, murder, and a family torn apart by secrets. The storm that had first sealed Black Pine Mountain in isolation now served as a cruel reminder of what had been lost. The search for Ivy had been suspended. No one wanted to admit it, but deep down, everyone feared the worst. The snowstorm had subsided, but the cold persisted, cutting through even the thickest coats like a blade. As the hours ticked by, the weight of Daniel's death and Wren's traumatized state hung heavy over Raven Ridge. Ellie Whitaker barely slept that night. Her mind refused to quiet, replaying every moment, every conversation she had shared with Daniel and Rachel. Had she missed something? A warning sign. Ellie couldn't stop going over the details in her mind, reaching out for any shred of understanding. Her heart had been torn open by grief, but it was anger that was growing inside her now. The morning after Wren was found, Ellie was met with a chilling discovery. The police had confirmed Rachel was missing. She hadn't shown up at the hospital, not even to see her own daughter. Her whereabouts were unknown, and she had vanished without a trace. Ellie knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. At the small diner in Raven Ridge, the locals gathered as usual, sharing the latest gossip over coffee. No one had the answers yet, but there were whispers. Did Rachel kill Daniel? They'd heard about the tension in the Whitaker marriage, but murder. It was too big to believe. Ellie, despite her growing suspicions, was too consumed by the thought of what had happened to Daniel, to Wren and now Ivy, to care about the whispers. She wasn't a fool. Rachel's disappearance wasn't a coincidence. The woman had been hiding something, and Ellie was determined to uncover it. It was the next day, when the police found Rachel's abandoned car on the outskirts of town, that Ellie's fears began to shift into certainty. Rachel had fled, but why? Had she been trying to escape the consequences of her actions? Or was there something even darker at play? The investigation deepened. Detective Michael Grant had been the lead investigator on the case from the beginning. He was an experienced officer, but this case had him rattled. He had seen murder before, but nothing like this. The brutality of it, the way Rachel had killed Daniel, was almost unfathomable. When Ellie finally spoke to Detective Grant, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He'd been working long hours piecing together the fractured story, but even his calm demeanor couldn't hide the shock of what they had uncovered. "Ms. Whitaker, we have reason to believe Rachel is not just a suspect in Daniel's murder, but an accomplice in something much bigger." We found something in her car, something that... Grant hesitated before continuing, something that points to a plan to kill. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. A plan, Grant nodded, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper from his folder. He laid it out on the table between them, revealing an address and some coordinates that appeared to have been marked multiple times. This came from Rachel's vehicle, along with a series of text messages between her and an unknown number. They were talking about, well, I'll spare you the details for now, but it looks like she'd been planning Daniel's murder for months. This wasn't just some spur-of-the-moment action. Ellie felt as if the room had been plunged into cold water. Months, Rachel had been scheming for months. But why and how did it involve the girls? Before she could ask another question, Grant stood up, his face grim. We think she may be heading toward the old logging camp up on Black Pine Ridge. We're going to send a team out there, but I need you to prepare yourself, Ms. Whitaker. Whatever we find, it's not going to be easy. Back at the hospital, Wren had barely spoken since the search party found her. The trauma of the events, the cold, the fear, the absence of her mother and father had left a mark on her. The little girl had barely touched the food that had been brought to her room. Ellie tried to comfort her, but it was difficult. The child was fragile, haunted by whatever she had witnessed in the woods, and Ellie couldn't blame her. Then came the breakthrough. Ivy's jacket was found tattered and discarded in a ravine near the logging camp. Ivy. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. The search had already extended to the logging camp, but this discovery changed everything. They had to find her. Now. The discovery of Ivy's jacket opened up a new chapter in the investigation. The police now knew that Rachel hadn't just disappeared, she had fled toward something. But what was her endgame? Ellie sat in the waiting room, trying to process everything. It was all happening too fast, too violently. It wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This was a tangled mess of deceit, betrayal, and, as Ellie feared, murder. Hours later, the police called. They had reached the logging camp. They had found Rachel. She was alive, but barely. Her eyes were wild, and she was incoherent, babbling something about a final reckoning. When they found her, she was holding something, Daniel's wallet drenched in blood. She had barricaded herself in the old cabin at the camp, ranting and raving. She was taken into custody, but the chilling part was her confession. Rachel admitted to everything. The confession came in a way Ellie hadn't expected. In the cold interrogation room, Rachel finally spoke her words, slipping out like a woman who had nothing left to lose. Daniel was weak. I couldn't live with him anymore. He was suffocating me, she muttered. I tried to fix it, but it was too late. I had to get rid of him. Ellie sat in her chair, stunned. Her body shook as she tried to hold it together. The woman she had once trusted, her daughter-in-law, had killed her son. Rachel's bitterness had festered into something monstrous, and in that moment Ellie realized the depth of Rachel's deception. But the worst part of Rachel's confession came next. The girls Rachel whispered almost too softly for Ellie to hear. They were always going to be a problem. They knew too much. That's why I had to leave them behind. Ellie couldn't breathe. Her mind went blank. The truth had come crashing down all at once, and there was only one thing left to do: find Ivy. The clock was ticking, and the mountain, Black Pine Mountain, held all the answers. But with the storm passing, time was running out. Ellie felt her resolve harden. Rachel had made a grave mistake, and Ellie, in her motherly instinct, was going to fix this. The web had unraveled. Now it was time to tie up the loose ends. Will Ellie find Ivy before it's too late? The answers lay hidden in the snow, and time was slipping away. The next morning, a chilling fog had settled over Raven Ridge. The town, once alive with the hum of daily life, now felt suffocated by uncertainty. Ellie, her face drawn with exhaustion and dread, sat in her truck, staring out at the dense trees that lined the base of Black Pine Mountain. Her mind kept returning to Rachel's last words, the implication that something far darker had taken place than anyone had imagined. Ivy. She had to find Ivy. Detective Grant had left her a voicemail that morning, explaining that the search team had circled the logging camp overnight, but there was still no sign of the little girl. They had found Rachel's footprint in the snow, but Ivy's trail had vanished. For hours, the search dogs had scoured the area, but the mountain had claimed its secrets once again. Why would Rachel leave Ivy behind? Ellie wondered aloud, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The more she thought about it, the more that question gnawed at her. Why had Rachel fled, leaving her youngest daughter to fend for herself? She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearly 8:00 a.m. Ellie knew that if she was going to get any answers, she needed to get to Blackpine Ridge, the heart of it all, before it was too late. The drive to the ridge took longer than Ellie expected. The winding road was treacherous, and with the fog thickening by the minute, visibility was poor. As she crested the final hill before the trailhead to the logging camp, she could see the remnants of the storm, broken trees, tangled brush, and abandoned vehicles buried under the weight of snow. The world was silent, too silent. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she parked her truck. The air was frigid and the snow crunched beneath her boots as she made her way to the group of officers stationed near the logging camp. Detective Grant was already there, his sharp eyes scanning the perimeter. "Any luck?" Ellie asked, her voice tight. Grant turned to her, his expression grim. "We've gone over every inch of this place. No sign of Ivy. It's like she vanished into thin air." Ellie's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. If Rachel had planned to abandon Ivy, why hadn't she simply left her near the cabin? Why bring her all the way to the edge of the mountain only to leave her behind? It didn't make sense. Grant spoke again, his voice lowered. "We found this." He pulled out a small silver locket from his jacket pocket and handed it to Ellie. Ellie's breath caught. It was Ivy's. She had seen that locket many times before. It had been a gift from Daniel, a small token of love that he had given to his daughters. Ellie could still hear his voice full of affection as he told Ivy how precious she was to him. "Where did you find this?" Ellie asked, her voice shaking. "Near the logging camp's edge, just off the trail. The locket was half buried in the snow, but we didn't find any other signs of her." Ellie felt a pang of panic. Ivy had dropped the locket. Was she running, or had something forced her to leave it behind? Grant's voice broke through her thoughts. "Ellie, we need to be prepared for the worst." Rachel's actions, they were calculated. This isn't just about Daniel's murder. She was planning something much bigger. We have reason to believe she knew exactly what she was doing when she left Ivy behind. Ellie's heart raced. She could hear the logic in Grant's words, but it was too much. How could Rachel be so cold? "I need to find her, Grant." Ellie said, her voice firm with determination. "I need to find Ivy before she becomes another casualty in Rachel's mess." The investigation moved quickly from there. The search team scoured the mountain for hours, but the fog and dense forest made tracking difficult. Ellie stayed close to Grant, unwilling to leave without news of her granddaughter. As the day wore on, the tension between them grew. The police officers and detectives had found nothing. There was no sign of Ivy anywhere. But then, just before nightfall, something unexpected happened. A voice crackled through the radio, a report from one of the search teams. "We found something." Ellie's heart leaped in her chest. She rushed to the radio, her breath fogging the cold air, where she asked, her voice tight with urgency. The voice on the other end paused. "Near the old logging shed, just past the first set of trees. We found fresh tracks. It's a girl's tracks. They lead into the woods." Ellie didn't wait for Grant to respond. She was already running toward the trail. Her boots crunched loudly in the snow as her legs burned from the cold and effort. She was so close now, so close to finding Ivy. But as Ellie entered the woods, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and an eerie silence filled the air. The woods felt wrong. The deeper Ellie ventured, the more she felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on her. Suddenly a shout rang out in the distance. Ellie spun around to see Grant waving from a clearing ahead. She pushed herself harder, reaching him in a few frantic strides. When she saw him, her heart sank. "It's Ivy, isn't it?" Ellie gasped, her voice trembling. Grant shook his head. "No. But we found something. You need to see this." Ellie's stomach twisted as Grant led her to a patch of woods near a jagged rock face. The snow had been disturbed here, footprints leading toward a small crevice between two large boulders. A backpack had been discarded at the base of the rocks, and Ellie's eyes widened as she recognized it. "Ivy's," she whispered. But as Ellie bent to pick it up, something else caught her eye. A scrap of paper half buried under the snow. With shaking hands, Ellie unfolded it. It was a note, a hurriedly scribbled message. It read, "I'll be back soon. Don't go looking for me." Ellie's blood ran cold. Rachel. She wasn't done yet. Ellie's hands trembled as she held the note. The paper was weathered, torn at the edges, and the ink had smeared slightly from exposure to the elements. But it was clear enough. Rachel's handwriting rough, hurried, and unmistakable. "I'll be back soon. Don't go looking for me." The words echoed in Ellie's mind, drowning out the sounds of the forest around her. There was no mistaking it. Rachel had been here. Rachel had left Ivy behind. The note felt like a final warning, a sign that the woman they were chasing had one last card to play. Grant stepped up beside Ellie, his eyes scanning the area. He didn't ask about the note. He knew better. Ellie's pale face told him everything he needed to know. He reached out to touch her shoulder. "We need to be careful," Grant said, his voice low. "Rachel's not just dangerous, she's playing a game, and she knows the mountain better than anyone." Ellie nodded, but her mind was far away. Why? Why leave Ivy? Was this some twisted plan? Was Rachel trying to manipulate them, to lead them into a trap I have to find? Ivy, Ellie muttered, her voice hoarse with urgency. The words barely felt real. It wasn't just about justice for Daniel anymore. It was about saving her granddaughters, saving the last piece of her son. Grant gestured for the team to start moving again, but Ellie was already off, following the tracks in the snow that led deeper into the woods. The further she ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. It was like the mountain itself was holding its breath. The search team moved quickly, but with every step Ellie took the weight of her years, seemed to settle heavier on her shoulders. Why hadn't Ivy run? Why hadn't she tried to escape? The more Ellie thought about it, the more she realized that something wasn't right. If Rachel had truly abandoned Ivy, why leave her so close to the logging camp? At the same time, Ellie couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that Rachel had left clues on purpose. She wasn't just running, she was orchestrating this. Every move, every decision felt calculated. Ellie's mind raced. Finally, they reached the old logging shed, a dilapidated structure on the outskirts of the forest. Its roof sagged under the weight of the snow, and the windows were boarded up. Ellie didn't wait for the rest of the team to catch up. She moved ahead, determined to find whatever Rachel had left behind. The air felt dense and suffocating here. There was something about this place, something that made Ellie's skin crawl. As she approached the shed, Ellie's eyes scanned the surroundings. The ground was covered in fresh tracks, more recent than the snowflakes that had fallen earlier in the day. The footprints were unmistakable, small, child-sized. Ivy. But as Ellie crouched down to get a better look, something caught her eye. A faint trail of blood, dark, almost black, against the white snow, snaked away from the shed and into the dense trees. Her heart skipped a beat. "No." Grant, Ellie shouted, her voice a mix of fear and desperation. "I found something." Grant came rushing to her side, his face a mask of concern. When he saw the blood, his face tightened. "Call for backup," Ellie said, her voice strained. "We need to get a team out here now." But as Grant reached for his radio, Ellie's eyes were already following the blood trail into the trees. Ivy had been hurt. The blood was too fresh to be old, too much for a minor injury. Rachel had done something to her daughter. The thought hit Ellie like a wave crashing against the shore. Rachel hadn't just abandoned Ivy, she had tried to hurt her. And Ellie was about to find out just how far her son's wife was willing to go to keep her secrets buried. They followed the trail deeper into the woods, each step heavier than the last. The sun was beginning to set, and the cold was creeping in like a living thing. But Ellie didn't care about the cold. Her only thought was Ivy, her innocent granddaughter in danger. The blood trail led them to a small clearing. There, partially hidden under a thicket of brambles, lay a pile of old wooden crates. Ellie's breath caught as she approached. Something was wrong. There was an unmistakable shape beneath the crates, a human shape. Grant was already kneeling next to it, his hand on the object. He pulled back the debris, revealing the crumpled figure of a child, Ivy, but she wasn't moving. Ellie's heart stopped. She rushed forward, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Ivy, sweetheart, she cried, her voice desperate. The moment Ellie touched her granddaughter's cold skin, Ivy's eyes fluttered open. For a moment Ellie thought she was imagining it, but Ivy's eyes slowly focused on her face. Grandma Ivy's voice was weak, trembling. Are you real?" Tears flooded Ellie's eyes as she gathered Ivy into her arms, cradling her as though the entire world had just shattered around them. "I'm here, baby. I'm here," Ellie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere. You're safe now." Ivy's face, pale and bruised, was marked by the signs of both fear and exhaustion. Her clothes were torn in places and her hands were raw. But she was alive. Ellie's prayers had been answered. As Ellie held her granddaughter, she couldn't help but look around the clearing, her thoughts racing. Rachel had left her here. She had hurt her. Why was Ivy part of some bigger plan? Had Rachel intended to leave her to die? Grant placed a hand on Ellie's shoulder. "We need to get her out of here," he said quietly, his voice filled with concern. "We'll get the medical team here as soon as we can." Ellie nodded, but her mind wasn't on Ivy's injuries anymore. It was on Rachel. Where was she now? The air was thick with tension as Ellie, Grant, and the medical team made their way back to the town. Ivy, now wrapped in a blanket, clung to her grandmother's side. Her breathing was shallow, and her body shivered uncontrollably, but she was alive. That was all that mattered. Ellie's mind, however, was far from calm. Rachel, her son's wife, the woman she had once welcomed into their family, was still out there. The thought gnawed at her insides like a festering wound. Where was she hiding? Had she already escaped into the mountains? Or was she lurking in the shadows, preparing to strike again? As they reached the edge of the town, Ellie's thoughts were interrupted by the screeching sound of tires. A car careened around the corner, speeding toward them. Ellie's heart leaped into her throat as the vehicle came to a screeching halt, throwing up gravel in its wake. It was a black SUV, Rachel's SUV. The door slammed open before the car had even fully stopped. Rachel. She stepped out, her expression a mixture of defiance and desperation. Her eyes locked with Ellie's, and for a moment everything else faded away. The entire world felt like it had shrunk to just the two of them standing at odds in the middle of the street. Ivy Rachel's voice was shrill, filled with anger and panic. She took a step forward, but Ellie's instinct was immediate. She stepped in front of Ivy, blocking her from Rachel's view. "What do you want, Rachel?" Ellie asked, her voice icy with hatred. Her fists clenched at her sides. There was no more room for the woman who had murdered her son. There was only room for justice. Rachel didn't speak for a moment, her eyes flicking from Ivy to Ellie, her lips trembling. Then, with a bitter laugh, she shook her head. "You're all so naive, Ellie." Rachel sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Ellie's blood ran cold. She could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. Rachel's movements were slow, but deliberate, as though she were calculating her next move. "I'll be taking Ivy with me," Rachel said, her words sharp as knives. "She belongs to me and you." She cut herself off with a bitter laugh. "You're not her family anymore." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of doubt passed through her. What if Rachel was right? What if she did have legal grounds to take Ivy back? But then Ellie looked down at Ivy, whose pale face had paled even further at the sight of her mother. No, Ellie knew better. Rachel wasn't a mother, she was a monster. And Ellie had made a promise to Daniel, to her son. "You'll never get away with this," Ellie said, her voice steady, unwavering. "I'm not letting you hurt Ivy anymore." At that moment the sound of sirens grew louder, and Ellie turned to see a police car pulling up behind them. Officers flooded out, taking positions on either side of the street. "Rachel Whitaker, you're under arrest," a detective called out, his voice calm but authoritative. Rachel's expression flickered fear, perhaps, but she quickly masked it with rage. "You can't do this to me," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. You'll never understand." Before Ellie could react, Rachel made a desperate lunge toward Ivy. It was instinct. Ellie moved in front of the child in an instant, her arms wide, protecting her granddaughter from the woman who had tried to destroy their family. The officers moved quickly, restraining Rachel before she could reach them. The air felt electric as the finality of the situation set in. As Rachel was led away, her face twisted in fury. Ellie looked down at Ivy, who was clinging to her with both hands. Ellie could feel the trembling in her body as the adrenaline wore off the weight of everything that had just happened, pressing down on her shoulders. Ivy looked up at her, eyes wide with fear. Is she gone now?" Ivy whispered, her voice small, uncertain. Ellie's heart broke at the sound of the question. She had been the one to save her, to bring her back from the brink of the abyss. But even now Ivy wasn't free. They weren't free. Not yet. But for the first time in what felt like years, Ellie allowed herself a small, faint smile. "She's gone, sweetheart. You're safe now." The sun rose slowly over the town the next morning, casting its golden light over the mountains that had once been a symbol of escape, now an endless reminder of the past few days. Ellie sat in the small diner at the edge of town, a cup of coffee warming her hands. The warmth, however, did little to soothe the storm still raging in her heart. Ivy and Wren were at home, both recovering. Wren's leg was healing well after surgery, and Ivy was slowly beginning to speak more, but the weight of what had happened still hung heavy between them. Ellie knew the road to healing would be long. The girls had lost so much already. She hadn't heard from Rachel since her arrest. The woman's trial was set to begin soon. The charges were heavy: first-degree murder, attempted murder, and child endangerment. It was the justice Ellie had fought for, but it still felt hollow. Nothing could bring Daniel back. "Morning, Ellie." The familiar voice of Cal Jennings broke through her thoughts as he slid into the seat across from her. He looked tired, worn down by his own guilt, but there was something different in his eyes. Remorse, yes, but also relief. Ellie nodded, her voice steady. The man who had once been a silent accomplice in Rachel's crimes was now seeking redemption. He leaned forward, his voice low. "I just wanted to say again how sorry I am. I can't undo the past, but I'm here to help however I can." Ellie sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I don't know what to make of you yet, Cal, but right now I'm just focusing on the girls. They need me. I understand." His gaze softened. "And you're doing the right thing, Ellie. You're a strong woman. Don't ever doubt that." She met his gaze, the weight of everything they'd been through pressing down on her. Had she made the right choices? She didn't know. But she couldn't let the guilt of the past haunt her. There was still life ahead for her granddaughters. They would find peace again, even if it took time. Just then the door of the diner opened and Ellie's attention shifted. A police officer entered holding an envelope. He walked straight to her table, handing it over without a word. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the letter. The trial was set to begin in 2 weeks, but more importantly, Ivy and Wren were safe. Ellie folded the letter, placing it in her bag. A small, cautious smile appeared on her face. The nightmare was over. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as she stood up to leave the diner, her heart lighter than it had been in days, Ellie knew one thing for certain: she would protect her granddaughters. And together they would rebuild. The past would always be with them, but it wouldn't define them. And that, Ellie thought, as she walked out into the fresh morning air, was a beginning.